Alright, so this video will focus on the age of exploration and will primarily focus on why Europeans began exploring in the 1400s. So during the 1400s and 1500s, Europeans began to explore the rest of the world. Just a note, this is going to overlap with the Renaissance, which we studied in January, and the Reformation, which we studied in February. Again, the Renaissance was a time of kind of cultural rebirth of Greek and Roman art, literature, architecture, and the Reformation was when Martin Luther stood up to the Catholic Church and new branches of Christianity were formed. So that's going to be happening kind of in the background as Europeans began to explore. And I just want to note, as we study the age of exploration, Europeans were discovering new places, but just be aware that those places had existed thousands of years before Europeans were aware of them. So they weren't quite discovering places, they were just realizing that these places existed for the first time. And kind of the big takeaway is the age of exploration brought together different parts of the world for the first time in centuries. And kind of the big focus is, why did exploration start in the 1400s? Like, why didn't it start earlier? And there are many reasons why exploration began when it did. Probably first and foremost, Europeans were made aware of spices and other Asian goods like silks. So before the Crusades, Europeans didn't really have access to Asian goods like spices and silks. They weren't as big on the European market. So after the Crusades and the increase of trade between Europe and Asia, Europeans began really desiring spices and silks. Again, spices made their food taste better, and silks showed off wealth because they could afford to buy silk from Asia. On top of that, exploration began around that time because Asian goods had cost a lot more money. So the prices had risen because the Muslim Turks, or the Ottoman Turks, controlled parts of Asia, and the Italians controlled the trade routes into Europe. So that really increased the price. And so the rest of Europe wanted to figure out other ways to make other ways to get spices and silks. In order to go by boat, Europeans had to have improved maps and knowledge of geography. They needed to have better compasses and navigational tools, and they needed to have improved ships design, which we'll look at a later slide. Now, they're going to get all of this knowledge. Again, the compasses, the ship design, the maps, they're going to get all of that from the Muslims and the Chinese. So that actually allows them to start exploring by sea. And I want you to think back to our earlier activity where we looked at how the silks and spices traveled along the Silk Road, making their way to the Mediterranean Ocean, and then making their way into Europe, and how much the price increased as the goods made their way along the Silk Road. And that's really going to be what pushes the Europeans to start exploring by sea. Their main goal with exploration is going to be finding an ocean route to Asia. So going by sea to Asia. So every early explorer was trying to find a sea route to Asia. And again, just to kind of help us visualize, if you find the yellow and red routes, those were the Venetian and Genoese routes, showing trade in Europe in the Middle Ages. So you can see that the yellow and the red routes are the ones leading from the Mediterranean into the rest of Europe. So the Italians controlled the flow of goods into Europe from Asia, which is another example of why the Italians controlled the Silk Road. And you'll actually find that Italy didn't have as much to do with exploration as other parts of Europe, again, because they already had access to those goods. The Europeans had improved ship design. This is the Caravel Redonda. It's a lot smaller than the Chinese junks that we saw earlier this year. It's a lot smaller, but notice that there are two different shapes of sails. There's square sails and triangular sails, and triangular sails actually help with sailing in the ocean because you can adjust them to catch the wind from any direction. And you'll notice that these boats also have a flat bottom, which makes it easier for them to sail in shallower waters. So again, Europeans had new ship design from the Muslims. So again, this is kind of a visual recap. In the bottom right corner, we see the spices and which were becoming increasingly popular and expensive in Europe. In the top right corner, we have the compass and the astrolabe, which helped Europeans navigate at sea. And then in the top left, we have a boat, which made it possible for Europeans to sail in the ocean.